We're keeping the guest list intimate and modern, which means no antiquated traditions or, well, you understand. My daughter explained over coffee as she casually removed my name from her engagement celebration, the 3-carat diamond ring I had secretly helped her fiancé purchase, catching the light with every dismissive gesture. 2 weeks later, I left my grandmother's leather-bound journal on her doorstep, its pages documenting 5 generations of our family's marriage traditions, and the special account I had been contributing to since her birth that had paid for half that perfect ring on her finger. 6 months later, I stood quietly in the back of a small garden ceremony, watching my daughter incorporate those same outdated traditions into her vows, her tearful eyes meeting mine as she finally understood that some legacies are worth preserving. Before we dive deeper into this journey, tell me where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something truly special coming your way that you won't want to miss. I was born Margaret Eleanor Whitfield on a particularly snowy February morning in 1953, in the small coastal town of Baybrook, Maine. The midwife who delivered me was the same woman who had brought my mother into the world 27 years earlier, part of a continuity of care and community that defined our little corner of New England. My childhood home was a modest Victorian near the harbor, a 3-story structure with weathered blue clapboards and white trim that had sheltered Whitfields since my great-grandfather purchased it with the proceeds from his fishing fleet in 1887. Our house stood as a physical testament to family continuity. The dining table where we gathered each evening had witnessed 4 generations of family meals. The creaking floorboards in the hallway had supported the footsteps of ancestors, whose photographs lined the stairwell wall. Even the gardens surrounding the house contained perennials planted by my great-grandmother, blooming year after year in a display of persistence that mirrored our family's approach to life. While we weren't wealthy in financial terms, my father managed the town's hardware store and my mother taught at the local elementary school. We were rich in traditions that bound our family together across time. My upbringing was shaped less by material abundance than by the wealth of stories, practices, and values that had sustained our family through wars, economic hardships, and social changes that had transformed the wider world while leaving our essential connections intact. My grandmother, Eleanor Victoria Whitfield, for whom I was named, was the living repository of our family's most treasured traditions, particularly those surrounding marriage and commitment. Born in 1903, she had witnessed breathtaking changes throughout her lifetime, from the introduction of automobiles and airplanes to television, and, in her later years, the space program. Yet these external transformations never shook her foundational belief in the continuity that family traditions provided in an ever-changing world. "The world will always be reinventing itself, Maggie," she would tell me as we sat together on the porch swing, watching fishing boats return to harbor in the golden afternoon light. "That's precisely why we need the anchor of traditions. Not to keep us from moving forward, but to give us something solid to push against as we grow." Grandmother Eleanor had survived the Great Depression, sent her husband off to World War II, uncertain if he would return, and raised my father largely on her own during those difficult years. These experiences had taught her that relationships required more than romantic feelings to endure life's inevitable challenges. I spent countless hours in her company throughout my childhood, absorbing not just specific traditions but the philosophy behind them, the understanding that intentional practices carried meaning that strengthened family bonds across generations. The kitchen became my primary classroom for these lessons. On Saturday mornings, Grandmother Eleanor would teach me to bake bread using her mother's recipes, each step infused with stories about the women who had performed these same actions in decades past. "Your great-grandmother taught me to knead dough during the Depression," she would explain, her arthritic hands guiding mine through the rhythmic motion. "We couldn't always afford eggs or milk, but she insisted that fresh bread on the table meant we were still civilized people, not just survivors. That's what traditions do. They keep us human during inhuman times." As my hands worked the dough, She would share stories of weddings during wartime, engagements announced before men shipped overseas, and marriages that endured despite years of separation and hardship. These weren't just entertaining tales, but instructional narratives about commitment, resilience, and the power of shared values to sustain relationships through difficulties that would have broken weaker bonds. Marriage isn't just about the couple. Maggie, she would tell me as we moved from baking to polishing the family silver together, pieces that had traveled across the Atlantic with our ancestors. It's about weaving two people into the fabric of something larger than themselves. That's why we have traditions. They're the threads that connect us to those who came before and those who will come after. Our family's marriage traditions were numerous but meaningful. The bride would always carry a handkerchief embroidered by the women of the family, each contributor adding a small section with stitches representing their wishes for the new couple. The ceremony would include a reading from my great-great-grandmother's journal about commitment during difficult times, words written during the Civil War that had guided family marriages through 2 world wars, economic collapses, and personal tragedies. And perhaps most importantly, each generation helped the next afford their first important symbol of commitment, typically the engagement ring. This wasn't a tradition born of wealth or materialism, but quite the opposite. It had begun during the Civil War, when my great-great-grandfather couldn't afford a proper ring to offer his bride before departing for battle. His parents and siblings pooled their meager resources to help purchase a simple gold band, understanding that this symbol would sustain the young couple through their separation. They didn't contribute because the ring itself mattered so much, Grandmother Eleanor explained as she showed me the original band, now worn thin with age. They contributed because it represented the family's investment in the couple's future. It said, "We stand behind this union. We are committed to its success even before it formally begins." This practice had continued through each generation, adapting to changing circumstances but maintaining its essential meaning. During the Depression, when cash was scarce, family members contributed small items of jewelry to be melted down and reformed into new rings. During more prosperous times, the tradition evolved into dedicated savings accounts to which even distant relatives would contribute small amounts over decades. A marriage begins long before the wedding day, Grandmother Eleanor would explain as she showed me her journal where she recorded family history and wisdom. Just as your grandfather and I saved for your parents' future, your parents now save for yours. And someday, you'll do the same for your children. The leather-bound journal itself was as much a part of our traditions as the financial practices it recorded. Started by my great-great-grandmother during the Civil War, it had been passed down through the female line, each keeper adding her own entries while preserving those that came before. Its pages contained not just financial records, but family, wisdom, relationship advice, and reflections on marriage during different historical periods. "This isn't just a book," Grandmother Eleanor would say, her voice softening with reverence as she carefully turned pages grown delicate with age. "It's a conversation across time. When I read my grandmother's words about her marriage during the Spanish flu epidemic, I hear her speaking directly to me. And when you read my entries someday, I'll be speaking to you long after I'm gone." This continuity, this sense of dialogue with ancestors and responsibility to descendants yet unborn, shaped my worldview from my earliest memories. The journal embodied a perspective that extended far beyond individual lifespans or personal desires, teaching me to see myself as part of an ongoing story rather than its central character. By age 15, I was already contributing small amounts to what my grandmother called the Next Generation Fund, quarters and dollars from babysitting jobs and summer work at the local ice cream parlor. It wasn't much, but the act of setting aside something for a future I couldn't yet imagine taught me to think beyond my immediate desires. Each contribution was carefully recorded in the journal, my adolescent handwriting appearing alongside entries dating back to the 1860s. "You're not just saving money, Maggie," my grandmother noted as she watched me record my small contribution. You're investing in a future that will exist long after we're gone. That's what family really means, thinking beyond your own lifetime. The practical nature of these traditions appealed to me even as a teenager. Unlike empty rituals maintained solely for tradition's sake, our family practices served clear purposes, addressing real human needs for connection, support, and meaning. The financial assistance for marriage symbols wasn't about materialism, but about making tangible the family's emotional investment in each new union. Money is just a tool, Grandmother Eleanor would remind me whenever I questioned whether saving for future rings was the best use of family resources. When directed with intention, it becomes something more, a physical expression of values that might otherwise remain abstract. That's why we don't just give money directly. We transform it into symbols that carry meaning. These weren't abstract concepts, but living practices that shaped my understanding of both family and commitment. The journal wasn't merely a book, but the physical embodiment of our values and continuity across time. Each entry connected us to previous generations who had maintained these traditions through wars, economic upheavals, and social changes. My teenage years coincided with the social revolutions of the late 1960s and early 1970s. While many of my peers embraced wholesale rejection of tradition in favor of counterculture ideals, my upbringing had taught me a more nuanced approach to balancing preservation and progress. When friends dismissed all traditions as oppressive relics of the past, I found myself defending the value of practices that provided continuity while still embracing necessary social changes. Tradition without adaptation becomes stagnation. I remember explaining to my bewildered high school boyfriend when he questioned why I bothered recording my small contributions in that old book. But adaptation without foundation becomes chaos. The trick is knowing which parts to preserve and which to evolve. My childhood unfolded in this world, where the past remained present through daily practices and conscious choices. At school, I studied modern subjects and embraced contemporary ideas about women's equality and social justice. At home, I learned how to balance innovation with tradition, not rejecting the new, but ensuring it built upon rather than replaced the foundations that had supported our family through difficult times. The physical spaces of our home reinforced these lessons. The parlor maintained Victorian formality with its original furniture and decor, while the kitchen had been modernized with convenient appliances. My bedroom featured both my grandmother's handmade quilt and posters of the Beatles. This wasn't contradictory but complementary, a visual representation of how tradition and innovation could coexist harmoniously when approached with intentionality, rather than reactive rejection or blind preservation. As I entered my senior year of high school, my grandmother's health began to decline. The arthritis that had troubled her hands for decades worsened until even writing in the journal became painful. Yet she insisted on continuing the practice, adapting by dictating entries to me that I would transcribe in my own hand while noting their true authorship. The hand that holds the pen matters less than the mind that forms the thoughts, she told me when I worried about the authenticity of these entries. What matters is that the wisdom continues, not the particular method of its recording. During these dictation sessions, she shared deeper aspects of our family traditions than she had previously revealed. The private struggles behind public celebrations, the doubts that had accompanied certainty, the ways in which each generation had questioned traditions before ultimately adapting rather than abandoning them. Your great-aunt Martha almost rejected the handkerchief tradition entirely in 1922, she confided, her voice carrying both amusement and understanding. She considered it hopelessly Victorian during the height of the flapper era. But rather than abandoning it, she redesigned the handkerchief with bold Art Deco patterns while maintaining the essential practice of family contributions. That redesigned handkerchief became the model for every wedding since. These stories, of adaptation rather than wholesale rejection, provided a framework for approaching tradition that acknowledged both its value and its need for continual renewal. Unlike rigid customs maintained through obligation alone, our family traditions survived because each generation found fresh meaning in practices that connected them to both past and future. The tangible symbol of this philosophy was my grandmother's journal, leather-bound, its pages filled with her elegant handwriting detailing family history, wisdom passed down through generations, and the ongoing records of contributions to future marriages. When she passed away during my senior year of high school, the journal passed to my mother, who continued the traditions with her own distinctive additions and perspectives. My mother's approach to the journal reflected her practical nature and educational background. Where grandmother Eleanor had written poetic reflections on marriage and commitment, my mother added pragmatic analyses of how family support systems functioned during different life stages. As an elementary school teacher, she brought clear, instructional elements to the tradition, creating indexed sections that organized previously scattered information into more accessible formats. Each generation adds their own voice to these traditions, Maggie, my mother explained, as she showed me how grandmother Eleanor had adapted her own mother's practices during changing times. We don't preserve traditions by freezing them in time, but by keeping their essence while allowing them to evolve. This understanding, that tradition could be both rooted and adaptive, became central to my approach to life as I moved into adulthood. The family practices weren't rigid rules, but living principles that could guide us through changing circumstances while maintaining connection to something larger than ourselves. As I prepared to leave for college in the fall of 1971, the first Whitfield woman to pursue higher education beyond teaching credentials, my mother presented me with a small leather-bound book that complemented the main family journal. "This is your personal continuation of the tradition," she explained as I unwrapped the carefully chosen gift. "The main journal stays with me for now, but this one travels with you. Record your contributions, your thoughts about commitment, your observations about relationships. Someday, these entries will join the larger record, but for now, they're your private dialogue with the women who came before you." This personal journal became my companion throughout college years, marked by social upheaval and changing norms around relationships and marriage. While many of my classmates embraced the sexual revolution's rejection of traditional commitment, I found myself appreciating aspects of both traditional and progressive approaches to relationships. Tradition without freedom becomes tyranny, but freedom without foundation becomes chaos, I wrote in one of my earliest entries, echoing lessons from my grandmother while applying them to the rapidly changing social landscape around me. The question isn't whether to embrace tradition or progress, but how to discern which elements of each truly serve human flourishing across generations. This balanced perspective sometimes made me feel like a bridge between worlds. Too traditional for my most progressive friends, yet too open to change for the more conservative elements of my hometown community. Rather than seeing this as a disadvantage, I gradually recognized it as a unique vantage point that allowed me to evaluate both old and new ideas based on their merits rather than their novelty or familiarity. Throughout these formative years, I continued contributing to the Next Generation Fund, even when my student budget made this challenging. Sometimes my contributions amounted to just a few dollars set aside from my campus job at the library. Other months allowed more substantial additions when I received scholarship funds or holiday gifts. The consistent practice mattered more than the amounts, teaching me that commitment manifests through regular actions, not dramatic gestures. Even during the Depression, your great-grandmother managed to set aside 3 pennies each month. My mother reminded me in her letters from home. It wasn't the amount that mattered, but the consistent choice to invest in a future beyond her immediate circumstances. This perspective, looking beyond immediate circumstances to longer horizons, shaped not just my financial habits but my approach to relationships and career decisions. While many peers made choices based primarily on immediate desires or opportunities, I found myself naturally considering how current decisions might affect possibilities decades into the future. By my junior year, When many classmates were graduating early to join protest movements or corporate America, I had already established a small but growing fund for my own future children, earmarked specifically for their eventual marriage symbols. The practice seemed anachronistic to some friends who questioned whether marriage itself would remain relevant in the coming decades. You're saving for something that might not even exist by the time your hypothetical children grow up, my roommate challenged when she discovered my careful record-keeping. Haven't you noticed? Everything's changing. Traditional marriage could be obsolete in 20 years. The form might change, I acknowledged, but the human need for commitment ceremonies and symbols won't disappear. If my children choose different paths, these funds will support whatever meaningful commitments they make. The tradition adapts to serve the underlying values, not to preserve specific forms. This understanding that traditions served deeper human needs beyond their surface appearances had been instilled through my grandmother's stories and my mother's practical adaptations. I wasn't preserving traditions for tradition's sake, but maintaining practices that addressed perennial human needs for connection, meaning, and intergenerational support. As graduation approached in 1975, my personal journal had grown thick with observations about relationships witnessed during college years, which approaches seemed to foster lasting connections and which led to painful disruptions. Without fully realizing it, I had begun creating my own contribution to family wisdom, filtered through the particular social context of my generation, but connected to the ongoing conversation across time that our journals represented. Commitment. Ceremonies matter not because society demands them, I wrote during my final semester, but because humans need markers that distinguish significant relationships from casual connections. Whether traditional marriage or alternative forms, the public declaration of private commitment serves both the couple and the community that supports them. These reflections weren't mere theory, but preparation for my own journey into marriage and family life. Though I couldn't yet envision the specific challenges my generation would face, I was developing a framework for approaching commitment that balanced respect for tradition with openness to necessary adaptation. The journal, now containing my own emerging wisdom alongside lessons inherited from previous generations, prepared me to navigate the rapidly changing social landscape while maintaining connection to enduring values. Not rigid preservation of outdated forms, but thoughtful evolution that kept the essential while adapting the expressions to contemporary circumstances. When I returned home after graduation, my mother formally transferred the main family journal to my keeping in a simple ceremony that echoed similar transitions going back 5 generations. As the newest caretaker of this physical embodiment of family continuity, I felt both the weight of responsibility and the honor of being entrusted with traditions that had sustained our family through decades of upheaval and change. Each keeper adds her unique perspective while honoring those who came before, my mother explained as she placed the worn leather volume in my hands. You'll make this tradition your own, as each woman before you has done. The journal remains the same object, but its meaning expands with each generation's contribution. As I stood on the threshold of adulthood, holding the physical repository of family wisdom that would soon guide my own marriage and motherhood, I understood that I wasn't just preserving the past, but actively shaping how these traditions would continue into future generations. The practices that had seemed occasionally burdensome in my youth now revealed themselves as gifts. Not restrictions, but foundations upon which I could build a meaningful life connected to something larger than myself. The summer of 1975 marked a significant transition in my life. Armed with my newly minted English literature degree and the family journal now entrusted to my care, I faced decisions about my future path. While many of my classmates rushed toward graduate school or corporate positions in distant cities, I felt drawn back to Baybrook, not from lack of ambition, but from recognition of the value in the community and connections that had shaped me. The Baybrook I returned to was not unchanged. The fishing industry that had sustained the town for generations was showing early signs of the decline that would later transform many coastal New England communities. Tourism was beginning to replace traditional industries, bringing summer visitors who admired our historic buildings and quaint harbor without understanding the economic anxieties underlying the picturesque facade. Found employment at the regional library system headquartered in our town, a position that combined my love of literature with practical community service. The work allowed me to help preserve local history while also introducing contemporary ideas and resources to a somewhat isolated community. This balance between preservation and innovation mirrored my personal philosophy about traditions, maintaining what remained valuable while adapting to changing circumstances. It was during my first autumn working at the library that I met Daniel Harrison, an architectural historian documenting New England coastal buildings for a preservation project. He had come to research Baybrook's remarkably intact 19th-century commercial district, but soon expanded his interests to include the residential neighborhoods where generations of the same families had lived in homes that told the story of American architectural evolution. Our professional relationship began when he visited the library seeking historical records about building practices specific to our region. I helped him locate materials ranging from contractor ledgers to town meeting minutes documenting construction disputes. What started as formal research assistance gradually evolved into wide-ranging conversations about how physical spaces preserve cultural memory and shape community identity. Buildings aren't just structures, Daniel explained during one of our impromptu discussions after the library had closed. They're records of how people understood their place in the world, what they valued enough to build solidly, what they considered worth preserving across generations, and how they balanced tradition with the needs of their particular moment. His perspective resonated deeply with my own understanding of family traditions. We were essentially discussing the same principles, just applying them to different domains. Where my family preserved intangible practices and written wisdom, Daniel focused on the physical manifestations of cultural values embedded in construction techniques, design choices, and adaptation patterns. That's exactly how I think about family traditions, I told him, sharing for the first time some details about our journal and marriage practices. They're not static monuments, but living structures that each generation renovates while maintaining the essential foundation. This shared philosophical ground provided the basis for a connection that deepened over the months of his research in Baybrook. Though Daniel was based in Boston, his project kept bringing him back to our town, each visit extending slightly longer than strictly necessary for his professional purposes. By the spring of 1976, these visits had become personal as well as professional, with architectural research serving as the increasingly thin pretext for our developing relationship. Daniel's approach to his work modeled the balance I valued between respect for tradition and openness to innovation. Unlike preservationists who insisted on historical purity at all costs, he advocated for thoughtful adaptation that maintained architectural integrity while accommodating contemporary needs. A building that can't evolve eventually gets demolished, he explained as we walked through Baybrook's historic district one evening, his hand gesturing toward a row of storefronts that had maintained their 19th-century facades while updating their interiors. The preservationists who won't allow any changes end up destroying what they meant to save. The trick is identifying the essential elements worth protecting while allowing necessary evolution. This philosophy, so similar to my grandmother's approach to family traditions, made Daniel uniquely receptive when I eventually shared more details about our family practices around marriage and commitment. Unlike some men of our generation who might have dismissed such traditions as antiquated constraints, he recognized their underlying purpose and adaptability. Your family was practicing cultural preservation long before it became a professional field, he observed after I showed him the journal for the first time, his historian's hands carefully turning pages that documented 150 years of family wisdom. Not preserving for preservation's sake, but because you recognize that certain practices carry values worth maintaining across changing circumstances. Our courting relationship unfolded against the backdrop of America's bicentennial celebrations, a period when the entire nation was engaged in reflection about which traditions remained meaningful and which needed reconsideration. This national conversation paralleled our personal discussions about how to honor heritage while embracing necessary change, creating a richly layered context for our developing commitment. By the autumn of 1976, Daniel had completed his formal research in Baybrook but continued his regular visits. During one weekend excursion to document a newly discovered 18th-century home in a neighboring town, he proposed marriage in a manner that thoughtfully incorporated elements of my family traditions while adding his own architectural perspective. "I've been studying how buildings endure across centuries," he said, as we stood on a hillside overlooking the harbor where my ancestors had once docked their fishing boats. "The ones that last aren't necessarily the most impressive or expensive, but those built with attention to both foundation and flexibility. I think the same principles apply to marriages." From his pocket, he produced not just a ring, but a small handcrafted wooden box he had made himself, its design echoing architectural elements from the Whitfield family home. Inside rested a diamond ring that combined his grandmother's stone, saved from her original setting, with a new design that incorporated subtle references to both our family's histories. "I spoke with your mother about the family tradition," he admitted as I examined the meaningful details of both ring and box. "She shared that there was a fund to help with this symbol, but I wanted to balance accepting that support with adding my own contribution. So the setting is new, designed specifically for you, while the stone represents both your family's investment and my family's heritage." This thoughtful integration of both traditions demonstrated precisely the approach to heritage that we shared, not rigid adherence to outdated forms, but meaningful adaptation that preserved essential values while responding to current circumstances. The ring became not just a symbol of our engagement, but a physical embodiment of the philosophy that would guide our marriage. Our wedding the following June reflected this same balanced approach. The ceremony incorporated readings from the family, journal, and the embroidered handkerchief tradition, while also including elements reflecting Daniel's architectural background and our shared commitment to community preservation. Rather than holding the reception at an impersonal venue, we gathered in the garden of the Whitfield family home, where generations had celebrated similar commitments. As we prepared to begin our married life, Daniel accepted a teaching position at a small college in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, close enough to maintain connection with Baybrook while offering professional opportunities that wouldn't have been available in our smaller community. We purchased our first home halfway between his workplace and mine, a neglected 1860s cottage whose restoration became both practical necessity and symbolic project, allowing us to literally build our married life on historical foundations while adapting the space to contemporary needs. Those early years of marriage brought the practical challenges of blending two independent adults into a functioning partnership, but our shared philosophy about balancing tradition and adaptation served us well. When disagreements arose, we approached them not as conflicts to be won, but as opportunities to create new traditions that would serve our particular family, while maintaining connection to the values that had shaped us. In 1979, I discovered I was pregnant with our first child. The impending arrival prompted deeper reflection about which family traditions we would maintain and how we might adapt them for a new generation being born into rapidly changing circumstances. The women's movement had transformed expectations about gender roles. Technology was reshaping work and community life, and economic pressures were creating new challenges for family stability. How do we preserve what matters without imposing outdated constraints? I wrote in the family journal during my 7th month, the rounded curve of my belly making writing physically awkward, but emotionally urgent. Which traditions truly serve human flourishing across changing circumstances, and which merely preserve forms that no longer connect to underlying purposes? These weren't abstract questions, but practical considerations about how we would raise a child to value continuity, without being limited by it. As Daniel and I prepared the nursery, painting the walls while discussing parenting philosophies, we found ourselves creating a vision for family life that honored heritage while embracing the unique possibilities of our particular moment in history. Our daughter Alexandra was born in February 1980, arriving during a snowstorm that temporarily isolated our home in a manner reminiscent of my own birth 27 years earlier. Despite the modern hospital setting and contemporary medical practices surrounding her arrival, I felt powerful connection to the generations of Whitfield women who had similarly weathered winter storms while bringing new life into the world. She bridges worlds, my mother observed when she first held her granddaughter, her teacher's hands cradling Alexandra with practiced confidence. Born into your generation, but carrying our family's history forward into a future we can't yet imagine. From her earliest days, Alexandra showed signs of the strong personality that would eventually challenge family traditions. Even as an infant, she displayed remarkable determination, refusing to sleep except on her own unconventional schedule, showing clear preferences that sometimes defied our careful planning. These traits that occasionally frustrated new parents would later become strengths when channeled through education and maturity, but they hinted at a fundamental independence that would shape her approach to family practices. As our daughter grew from infant to toddler, I maintained the tradition of contributing to next-generation funds for future family marriages. With Alexandra's birth, I had opened a specific account dedicated to her future marriage symbol, whatever form that might eventually take. Monthly contributions remained modest during those early years when our young family balanced mortgage payments, student loans, and childcare costs, but the consistent practice maintained connection to the intergenerational perspective that had shaped my own development. It's not about accumulating substantial amounts early, I explained to Daniel as we reviewed household finances during Alexandra's third year. It's about establishing the pattern of thinking beyond our immediate needs to consider future generations. The practical benefit comes through consistency over decades, not dramatic gestures. This perspective, balancing practical financial planning with symbolic connection to family traditions, characterized our approach to parenting throughout Alexandra's childhood. We incorporated meaningful traditions from both our families while allowing space for our daughter to develop her own relationship to these practices. The 1980s brought significant economic and cultural changes to New England communities like ours. Traditional industries continued their decline while professional and service sectors expanded, transforming local economies and community structures. The Reagan era's emphasis on individual achievement and financial success influenced a generation of children growing up during this period, including Alexandra, who absorbed these messages alongside the family values we attempted to instill. By elementary school, Alexandra's personality had developed distinct characteristics that sometimes created tension with family traditions emphasizing community over individual achievement. Where the Whitfield approach had historically balanced personal development with family responsibility, Alexandra showed stronger inclination toward independence and self-definition from an early age. She has her own vision for everything, Daniel noted with a mixture of pride and concern after Alexandra, at age 8, had firmly rejected our suggestions for redesigning her bedroom in favor of her own surprisingly sophisticated plan. That independence will serve her well in many contexts, but it may create challenges around family traditions that require subordinating individual preferences to collective practices. This observation proved prescient as Alexandra moved through childhood into adolescence. While she participated in family traditions with varying degrees of enthusiasm, she increasingly questioned their underlying purposes and occasionally challenged their relevance to contemporary circumstances. These challenges weren't simple rebellion, but thoughtful critiques that required equally thoughtful responses. Why should I contribute to someone else's future wedding when I might not even want to get married? She asked at 12, her practical mind analyzing the financial aspects of our traditions with precocious clarity. Wouldn't it make more sense to save for education or housing? Things everyone needs regardless of their relationship choices? Rather than dismissing these questions or imposing compliance, we engaged with them seriously, explaining the underlying purposes of traditions while acknowledging that expressions might evolve to address changing circumstances. These conversations became opportunities to articulate values that might otherwise have remained implicit, helping Alexandra understand the reasoning behind practices that might initially appear arbitrary. The tradition isn't about wedding funding. Specifically, I explained, pulling out the family journal to show her entries from different historical periods. It's about concrete expression of the principle that each generation supports the next's significant life transitions. Your great-great-grandmother's generation focused on marriage because that was the primary life transition requiring community support. If your generation faces different significant transitions, the tradition can adapt to address those while maintaining the underlying value of intergenerational support. Alexandra's relationship with family traditions evolved during her teenage years as she developed stronger academic identity and future ambitions. Her exceptional performance in mathematics and sciences pointed toward career paths far removed from the coastal community where generations of our family had lived. While we supported her developing talents, we also sought to maintain connection to the values and practices that had sustained our family through previous periods of change and transition. The journal became a point of both connection and occasional conflict during these years. Alexandra appreciated its historical significance from an intellectual perspective, but sometimes chafed at the expectation that she would eventually continue the tradition of recording family wisdom and tracking intergenerational financial support. It's a fascinating primary source, she commented after completing a high school history project that had incorporated some of the journal's Depression-era entries. But I don't know if I see myself continuing it in the same way. It feels designed for a different kind of life than the one I'm planning. This comment revealed the growing divergence in our visions for family continuity. Where I saw adaptable traditions that could accommodate changing circumstances while maintaining essential connections, Alexandra increasingly viewed these practices as artifacts of a lifestyle she was preparing to leave behind. Her academic success and ambition pointed toward urban professional environments, where such family practices might seem incongruent with contemporary realities. By her senior year of high school in 1998, Alexandra had developed clear plans for her future that prioritized academic achievement and career development over community connection or family continuity. Her exceptional SAT scores and academic record opened doors to prestigious universities far from New England, and she set her sights on economics programs that would prepare her for the financial sector careers that dominated the late 1990s landscape. I want to understand how global markets function, she explained when describing her college plans and longer-term aspirations. The financial systems that shape communities like Baybrook from a distance, that's where meaningful decisions happen, in today's world. This perspective reflected both her genuine intellectual interests and the broader cultural shift toward viewing success primarily through professional achievement and financial metrics, rather than community contribution or family continuity. While we supported her educational goals, we also attempted to maintain connection to values that might provide balance to the achievement-oriented environments she would soon enter. When Alexandra departed for the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School in the fall of 1998, I gave her a small leather-bound journal similar to the one my mother had given me before college. Though physically reminiscent of the family's main journal, this book contained only blank pages, space for her to develop her own relationship with family traditions rather than imposing specific practices. This isn't an obligation, but an invitation, I explained as she packed the journal among textbooks and computer equipment that represented her future-focused perspective. Whether or not you maintain family traditions in their current form, understanding where you come from provides foundation for wherever you're going. Record whatever seems meaningful to you, in whatever form makes sense for your life. This gesture, offering connection without imposing conformity, seemed well received in the moment. Alexandra placed the journal carefully among her personal items rather than leaving it behind with childhood mementos, suggesting at least openness to maintaining some form of continuity despite her forward-focused orientation. The college years accelerated Alexandra's divergence from family traditions as she immersed herself in academic excellence and professional preparation. Her rare visits home revealed increasing disconnection from the rhythms and values of the coastal community where she had grown up. Holiday conversations highlighted our differing perspectives on what constituted meaningful life priorities and how individual achievements related to broader community responsibilities. "The whole financial system is transforming," she explained during her junior year winter break, her enthusiasm for market innovations contrasting with local concerns about economic stability. "These new investment vehicles and trading mechanisms are creating opportunities that simply didn't exist for previous generations. The constraints that shaped traditional financial planning are becoming irrelevant." This perspective, prioritizing innovation over continuity, extended beyond financial matters to her approach to relationships and life planning generally. Where family traditions had emphasized long-term commitments supported by community structures, Alexandra embraced the flexibility and individual autonomy that characterized early 2000s professional culture, particularly in the financial sector she planned to enter. Despite these diverging perspectives, we maintained financial contributions to the account established for her future marriage symbol, adapting the practice to accommodate changing circumstances without abandoning its essential purpose. Rather than specifying a traditional engagement ring, we mentally reframed this fund as support for whatever significant life commitment she might eventually make, whether traditional marriage or alternative partnership. The tradition adapts to serve its purpose, not to preserve specific forms. I reminded myself when recording these contributions in the family journal, echoing wisdom that had guided previous generations through their own periods of social transformation. What matters is maintaining the underlying value of intergenerational support, not dictating the particular expression that support might take. Alexandra graduated with honors in 2002, entering the financial sector just as it was recovering. From the dot-com bubble burst and beginning the expansion that would characterize the pre-2008 era, her first position with a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan physically removed her further from New England traditions, while immersing her in corporate culture that valued innovation and individual achievement above historical continuity. Our relationship during these early professional years remained loving, but increasingly marked by mutual incomprehension regarding fundamental values. Alexandra's visits home became less frequent and shorter in duration, her conversation dominated by career developments and urban experiences that shared little common ground with the community-oriented life Daniel and I had built. "I sometimes feel like we're speaking different languages," I confided to the journal after one particularly disconnected Christmas visit. "Not just different vocabularies, but entirely different conceptual frameworks for understanding what makes life meaningful. How do traditions adapt when the underlying assumptions about human flourishing have diverged so dramatically?" This question, how to maintain meaningful connection across not just generational but philosophical divides, became increasingly central to my relationship with Alexandra as she established herself professionally and personally in environments far removed from the values that had shaped her upbringing. The growing gap wasn't just geographic, but conceptual, reflecting fundamentally different approaches to balancing individual achievement with community responsibility. In 2005, Alexandra accepted a significant promotion that expanded her professional responsibilities while further integrating her into financial sector culture. Her rare communications home focused almost exclusively on career milestones and material acquisitions, rather than relationships or community connections. When she purchased her first Manhattan apartment at 25, an achievement requiring substantial financial resources in that market, her description emphasized investment potential rather than home building or community integration. "The appreciation potential in this neighborhood is exceptional," she explained during a brief phone call announcing the purchase. Property values have increased 38% over the past 5 years, with projections suggesting accelerated growth following the planned corporate development 2 blocks away. This framing, prioritizing financial metrics over emotional or community considerations, typified the growing divide in our approaches to life decisions. Where family traditions had emphasized home as foundation for relationships and community engagement, Alexandra's perspective focused primarily on economic calculations and status positioning within her professional peer group. Despite these differences, we continued maintaining the account established for her future marriage symbol, though my private reflections in the journal acknowledged increasing uncertainty about whether this tradition would ever find meaningful expression in her life choices. The practice remained important not because of certainty about its eventual utilization, but because it represented commitment to values that transcended immediate circumstances or individual preferences. The question isn't whether Alexandra will use these funds as previous generations have done, I wrote during the account's annual review in 2006. The question is whether maintaining this practice preserves something valuable regardless of its eventual expression, whether the act itself of thinking beyond immediate circumstances and individual desires cultivates perspective worth preserving even if specific applications change dramatically. This reflection captured the essential challenge of maintaining traditions during periods of fundamental social transformation, discerning which aspects serve enduring human needs across changing circumstances versus which elements have become attached to specific historical expressions that may no longer serve their original purposes. The following year brought unexpected developments that would eventually lead to the central conflict in our story. In early 2007, Alexandra mentioned during a rare Sunday phone call that she had begun dating someone whose background and perspectives seemed to complement her professional ambitions and lifestyle preferences. "His name is Edward Harrington," she explained with uncharacteristic animation in her voice. "He's a partner at Blackstone Capital, graduated Harvard Business School, family connections throughout the financial sector. We met at an industry conference and discovered we have identical perspectives on practically everything that matters." This description, focusing exclusively on professional credentials and strategic alignment rather than personal qualities or emotional connection, reflected Alexandra's approach to relationships as extensions of her career development and lifestyle design. Where family traditions had emphasized marriage as covenant connecting generations through shared values, her framework prioritized partnership as strategic alliance focused on individual advancement and asset optimization. Over the following months, Alexandra's communications included increasingly frequent references to Edward and their developing relationship. These mentions focused primarily on shared professional activities and compatible approaches to financial planning, with minimal attention to emotional dimensions or longer-term implications beyond career advancement. Edward's family maintains a summer property in the Hamptons that appreciates approximately 12% annually, she noted during one brief call. "We've been discussing optimal approaches to leveraging similar properties as inflation hedges while maintaining liquidity for potential market opportunities." This framing, approaching even leisure properties primarily as investment vehicles rather than spaces for relationship building or family continuity, highlighted the growing divergence between Alexandra's values and the traditions that had shaped previous generations. The contrast became particularly evident when Daniel and I finally met Edward during a brief visit Alexandra arranged when they were passing through Boston for a professional conference. The dinner meeting lasted precisely 90 minutes, scheduled between their afternoon presentation and evening networking event, and unfolded with the efficient cordiality of a business meeting rather than family introduction. Edward presented himself with polished professionalism, his conversation revealing impressive credentials and strategic thinking, but minimal personal disclosure or emotional engagement. "Alexandra has described your family's historical connection to coastal New England," he commented when Daniel mentioned our community's architectural preservation efforts. Those legacy properties often represent underutilized capital that could be optimized through strategic repositioning in the current market environment. This perspective, viewing even historical communities primarily through investment potential rather than cultural or relational value, epitomized the worldview that increasingly separated Alexandra's generation from the traditions we had attempted to transmit. The dinner concluded with precisely timed efficiency, leaving Daniel and I with complex impressions of the man who might eventually become part of our family, despite values that seemed fundamentally misaligned with its historical foundations. "They're perfectly matched in their priorities," Daniel observed as we drove home afterward. "The question is whether those shared priorities leave space for the kinds of values and connections that have sustained families through difficulties that financial success alone can't address." This question, whether professional alignment could substitute for deeper value connections in creating sustainable relationships, remained unanswered as Alexandra and Edward's relationship developed over subsequent months with minimal family involvement. Their communications remained infrequent and focused primarily on logistical matters, rather than meaningful personal updates or relationship milestones. In December 2007, just before the financial crisis that would transform the economic landscape, Alexandra called with news that she and Edward had decided to marry, though they preferred the term formalize their partnership and planned minimal ceremonial elements focused primarily on legal and financial arrangements rather than community celebration or family traditions. "We're planning a small civil ceremony focused on efficiency rather than unnecessary expense," she explained with characteristic pragmatism. "Edward's parents understand our approach. They've already transferred the tax-advantaged portions of their estate planning allocations as engagement recognition." This framing, approaching even marriage primarily as legal and financial transaction rather than community covenant or family milestone, crystallized the philosophical divide that had been developing throughout Alexandra's adult years, where family traditions had emphasized marriage as connection point between generations supported by community practices. Her approach prioritized individual preferences and financial optimization with minimal acknowledgement of broader contexts or responsibilities. The conversation left me with complex emotions that I later processed through writing in the family journal, continuing tradition of reflection that had helped previous generations navigate their own periods of social transition and family evolution. These reflections acknowledged both genuine desire for Alexandra's happiness and concern about relationships built primarily on shared professional ambitions, rather than deeper value connections. "The question isn't whether her choices match our preferences," I wrote after extensive consideration. "The question is whether these choices create foundation for sustained flourishing through inevitable difficulties that require resources beyond financial success or strategic alignment." Previous generations faced wars, economic collapse, and social upheaval that tested relationships founded on much deeper connections than professional compatibility. This reflection, balancing acceptance of Alexandra's autonomy with concern about foundations insufficient for long-term flourishing, captured the essential tension facing parents attempting to transmit values across generational divides characterized not just by different preferences, but fundamentally different conceptions of human purpose and relationship. As wedding plans developed with minimal family consultation, I faced decisions about how to approach family traditions that Alexandra seemed unlikely to incorporate or appreciate in their traditional forms. The journal, handkerchief practices, and financial contributions toward marriage symbols represented not just specific customs, but embodied values about intergenerational connection and community support that transcended their particular expressions. After careful consideration, I decided to maintain these traditions despite uncertainty about their reception, not imposing them on Alexandra's ceremony, but preserving their availability should perspectives evolve through life experience or changing circumstances. This approach honored both her autonomy in current choices and the possibility that values temporarily obscured by professional culture might eventually re-emerge through life's inevitable challenges and transitions. The account established for her future marriage symbol had grown steadily over decades of consistent contributions, eventually reaching significant value despite modest individual deposits. Whether these funds would find expression in traditional engagement ring or alternative form remained uncertain, but maintaining the practice preserved options that immediate abandonment would have foreclosed. Traditions adapt or disappear based on whether they continue serving genuine human needs, I reminded myself while reviewing the account statements. Our responsibility isn't forcing specific expressions, but maintaining practices that embody enduring values, leaving space for future generations to discover or rediscover their relevance through their own life experiences. This perspective, maintaining traditions without imposing them, would soon be tested through conflicts that would reveal whether family practices merely preserved outdated forms or embodied values with enduring relevance across changing social circumstances and generational worldviews. The economic collapse of 2008 transformed more than just financial markets. As institutions once considered unshakable, faltered, or failed entirely, the crisis exposed fundamental questions about values, priorities, and what truly sustains individuals and communities through difficult times. This period of upheaval provided stark contrast between approaches to life founded primarily on financial metrics versus those built on deeper community connections and intergenerational support systems. Alexandra and Edward navigated these turbulent times from within the financial sector itself, their careers temporarily disrupted but ultimately enhanced by opportunities created through market volatility and institutional reorganization. While thousands lost homes and retirement savings, those with specialized knowledge and strategic positioning often found ways to leverage crisis into personal advantage, a reality that further widened the philosophical divide between Alexandra's worldview and the values embodied in family traditions. Edward's firm has actually expanded its market position through strategic acquisitions of distressed assets, Alexandra explained during a rare call home in early 2009, her voice conveying professional excitement seemingly disconnected from the broader economic suffering the crisis had created. We're positioning ourselves to capitalize on undervalued properties in markets experiencing temporary liquidity constraints. This framing, approaching economic crisis primarily as investment opportunity rather than human tragedy requiring community response, highlighted the growing disconnect between her values and those that had sustained our family through previous periods of hardship. Where the journal documented how earlier generations had responded to the Depression by strengthening mutual support systems and collective practices, Alexandra and Edward's approach prioritized strategic positioning for maximum individual advantage amid systemic instability. Despite these philosophical differences, wedding plans proceeded with characteristic efficiency through early 2009. Alexandra and Edward hired a celebration consultant to manage logistical details with minimal personal involvement, approaching the event as project to be optimized, rather than meaningful transition to be ceremonially acknowledged. Their communications about these arrangements focused almost exclusively on practical considerations, rather than symbolic elements or family inclusion. The consultant has identified a venue that balances optimal location metrics with cost efficiency, Alexandra informed us during one of her increasingly infrequent calls. We're targeting the third Saturday in June based on statistical analysis of weather patterns and availability of key participants from Edward's professional network. This approach, treating even wedding planning as analytical exercise rather than emotional or cultural process, created natural tension with family traditions that emphasized meaningful ritual and community participation. Without explicitly rejecting these traditions, Alexandra simply proceeded as if they were irrelevant to her contemporary circumstances, leaving Daniel and me uncertain about how to offer traditional elements without imposing unwelcome expectations. Spring progressed and wedding details solidified. I faced increasingly urgent decisions about family traditions that remained meaningful to me, but seemed disconnected from Alexandra's vision for her future. The journal, handkerchief customs, and financial contributions toward marriage symbols represented not just specific practices, but embodied values about intergenerational connection that seemed absent from her approach to commitment. After careful reflection, I decided to raise these traditions directly but gently, offering rather than imposing these elements that had connected generations of women in our family. During a rare Sunday when Alexandra had scheduled a 30-minute call for wedding updates, I cautiously introduced the topic of family practices that might be incorporated into her ceremony if she found them meaningful. I've been thinking about some family traditions that have evolved through different generations, I began, carefully choosing language that emphasized adaptation rather than rigid preservation. The embroidered handkerchief has taken different forms for different eras. Your great-aunt redesigned it with Art Deco elements in the 1920s, and your grandmother added mid-century modern styling in the 1950s. I wondered if you might want to continue that evolution with your own contemporary interpretation. Alexandra's response revealed how completely her perspective had diverged from the values these traditions represented. Mom, we're minimizing decorative elements that serve no functional purpose. The celebration consultant has created a streamlined aesthetic that maximizes visual impact while eliminating unnecessary sentimentality. This framing, reducing meaningful family practices to decorative elements and unnecessary sentimentality, demonstrated not just rejection of specific traditions, but fundamental misalignment with their underlying values. Where these practices had embodied belief in connections transcending individual lifespans, Alexandra's approach prioritized immediate efficiency and contemporary aesthetic over historical continuity or cultural meaning. Similar disconnections emerged around other traditional elements, from readings selected from the family journal to financial contributions toward marriage symbols. Though never explicitly dismissive, Alexandra consistently redirected these conversations toward logistical details and practical considerations, treating traditions as irrelevant distractions rather than potential resources for navigating significant life transitions. The account established for her future marriage symbol presented particular complexity, given her apparent disinterest in traditional engagement practices. Edward had already purchased a ring selected primarily for investment value rather than symbolic significance, a 3-carat diamond chosen for its market appreciation potential as much as its aesthetic qualities. Whether Alexandra knew about the family's financial tradition remained unclear, as she had never acknowledged the practice despite its documentation in the journal she had occasionally examined. We should discuss the next generation account, I suggested during another brief conversation about wedding arrangements. There's a significant balance that traditionally contributes to marriage symbols as tangible expression of family support. For new unions, Alexandra's response again revealed the philosophical gulf between our perspectives. Edward has already handled the ring through his family's estate planning structure. It's been properly insured and documented for eventual inclusion in our portfolio diversification strategy. This approach, treating even engagement symbols primarily as financial assets, rather than meaningful expressions of commitment supported by community, highlighted how completely market thinking had displaced relational understanding in her framework for significant life decisions. The ring existed primarily as investment rather than symbol, its value measured in financial appreciation potential rather than cultural or emotional significance. As wedding preparations continued with minimal family consultation, I struggled to find appropriate balance between respecting Alexandra's autonomy and maintaining traditions that embodied values I still considered essential for sustainable relationships. These traditions had evolved through multiple generations and historical periods precisely because they addressed enduring human needs for continuity and support that transcended specific social customs or economic systems. The question isn't whether traditions take exactly the same form across generations, I reflected in the journal during this challenging period. The question is whether the underlying values find meaningful expression appropriate to changing circumstances. Previous generations adapted specific practices while maintaining essential commitments to intergenerational support and community connection. How do these values find expression when the very framework for understanding human relationships has shifted so dramatically? This reflection, attempting to separate essential values from specific historical expressions, represented continuing effort to adapt rather than abandon traditions that had sustained our family through previous periods of social transformation. The journal itself documented similar struggles during earlier transitions, from Victorian formality to Jazz-age modernization to post-war suburban reorganization, each generation finding fresh expressions for enduring values despite changing social circumstances. The pivotal moment in our relationship arrived unexpectedly in early May, approximately 6 weeks before the planned wedding date. Alexandra had scheduled a coffee meeting during brief New York visit Daniel and I had arranged, primarily to connect with wedding vendors and clarify our limited role in ceremony preparations. The location, a sleek Manhattan coffee shop emphasizing minimalist design and premium pricing, reflected her aesthetic preferences and urban lifestyle rather than accommodating our unfamiliarity with city navigation or preferences for more conversational environments. From the moment we arrived, Alexandra's demeanor suggested this meeting had specific purpose beyond general wedding discussion. Her characteristic efficiency appeared heightened, with tablet computer open to what appeared to be agenda points and timeline notations. After perfunctory greetings and minimal personal inquiries, she transitioned directly to apparent purpose for the meeting. "I've been analyzing optimal guest distribution for the celebration," she began, referring to spreadsheet displayed on her tablet. "The venue space configuration and social dynamics considerations suggest need for significant guest list refinement to maximize interaction quality and documentation opportunities. This framing, approaching even wedding attendance as optimization problem rather than meaningful community gathering, should have prepared me for what followed. Yet the actual statement still created moment of genuine shock that momentarily suspended my comprehension of its implications. We're keeping the guest list intimate and modern, which means no antiquated traditions or, well, you understand," Alexandra continued, her manicured finger casually sliding my name from the digital guest list displayed on her tablet screen. The 3-carat diamond ring I had secretly helped her fiancé purchase caught the light with every dismissive gesture, its brilliance creating jarring contrast with the casual elimination of mother from daughter's wedding celebration. The moment expanded into suspended animation as I processed her words, my mind struggling to reconcile their literal meaning with basic assumptions about family connection that had shaped my understanding of human relationships across decades. However anticipated the growing distance between our values might have been, this explicit exclusion from life milestone, traditionally binding generations together, created cognitive disconnect that temporarily prevented coherent response. "I don't think I do understand," I finally managed, my voice steadier than the emotional turbulence beneath it would suggest. "You're saying your father and I are not invited to your wedding?" Alexandra's response combined corporate efficiency with psychological framing that effectively positioned her decision as reasonable adaptation to contemporary norms rather than extraordinary rejection of fundamental family connections. "Dad's technical expertise will be needed for documentation purposes, so he'll attend in photography capacity rather than traditional father role. The celebration consultant has created streamlined participation plan that eliminates outdated ceremonial elements while maintaining essential documentation coverage. This explanation, reducing even parental wedding participation to functional roles evaluated through technical contribution rather than relational significance, revealed how completely market thinking had displaced family understanding in her decision framework. Relationships existed primarily to serve practical purposes, rather than as fundamental connections carrying intrinsic value regardless of utilitarian contribution. "And my role in this streamlined approach to your wedding?" I asked. "Emotional. Control maintained through decades of practicing perspective-taking across challenging circumstances." Alexandra's answer emerged with practiced corporate diplomacy that conveyed uncomfortable message through language designed to minimize potential conflict while maintaining decisional authority. The current ceremony structure prioritizes forward-looking elements over historical continuity. Your traditional perspectives, while valuable in appropriate contexts, create potential asymmetry with our vision for optimized celebration, focused on future trajectory rather than historical patterns. This framing, positioning even mother-daughter relationship as potentially disruptive asymmetry in otherwise optimized event, completed transformation of wedding from family milestone to personal brand statement designed for strategic impression, management rather than community acknowledgement of significant life transition. The decision reflected not just different preferences, but fundamentally different understanding of what marriage itself represented and how it connected to broader social and historical contexts. My response required careful calibration between honest expression of the decision's emotional impact and respect for Alexandra's autonomy, despite profound disagreement with her values. After moments' consideration, I chose directness tempered by recognition of her right to make choices reflecting her own understanding, however misaligned with family traditions those choices might be. "I understand you're making choices consistent with your values," I acknowledged, maintaining composure despite extraordinary circumstance of being excluded from only daughter's wedding. "Those values differ significantly from those that have guided our family through previous generations, but they're choices you have right to make. I hope they create foundation for lasting happiness and relationship that sustains you through life's inevitable challenges." Alexandra's expression suggested momentary recognition of the decision's emotional significance beyond its logical optimization, brief flicker of doubt crossing her professionally composed features before corporate efficiency reasserted itself. The celebration consultant assures us this approach aligns with contemporary best practices for couples prioritizing career-focused lifestyle integration. Statistical analysis suggests traditional elements correlate with decreased satisfaction metrics among our demographic cohort. This response, deferring even emotional understanding to consultant analysis and statistical correlation, demonstrated complete surrender of personal judgment to professional opinion and data metrics, approaching even significant relationship decisions through outsourced expertise rather than individual moral discernment or family wisdom. The contrast with Journal's record of thoughtful personal reflection across generations could hardly have been starker. The remainder of our brief meeting proceeded with logistical discussions rendered surreal by underlying reality of mother's exclusion from daughter's wedding. Alexandra maintained professional demeanor throughout, transitioning efficiently between agenda items while minimizing emotional engagement or acknowledgement of the decision's extraordinary nature. When our allocated time concluded, she gathered her materials with characteristic precision before delivering parting statement that attempted to normalize the abnormal through corporate language. "I appreciate your understanding of our vision-aligned approach to the celebration," she concluded, already reaching for her phone to check messages accumulated during our brief interaction. "The consultant will forward relevant logistical details to Dad regarding his documentation responsibilities." With that clinical conclusion to conversation that had fundamentally redefined our relationship, Alexandra departed for her next appointment, leaving Daniel and me sitting in stunned silence amid busy coffee shop, whose fashionable patrons continued their conversations oblivious to relationship fracture that had just occurred at our small table by the window. "Did that actually happen?" Daniel finally asked, his historian's analytical distance temporarily overwhelmed by parental disbelief at daughter's capacity to exclude mother from wedding without apparent emotional recognition of the decision's significance. "It happened," I confirmed, decades of maintaining perspective through challenging circumstances providing foundation for composure that surprised even me in that extraordinary moment. Not just the decision itself, but the framework behind it, approaching even family relationships through optimization metrics and consultant recommendations rather than moral reflection or emotional understanding. We spent the remainder of our New York visit in state of suspended processing, mechanically meeting with vendors and completing planned activities, while internally grappling with implications of fundamental values disconnect that Alexandra's decision had revealed. The exclusion itself, while personally painful, mattered less than what it signified about her understanding of family, commitment, and relationships generally. Framework that seemed to leave minimal space for connections not defined primarily through functional contribution or strategic alignment. Upon returning home to New Hampshire, I found myself drawn to the family journal with urgency I hadn't experienced since my grandmother's final illness decades earlier. The leather-bound volume, containing generations of wisdom about sustaining relationships through challenging circumstances, offered perspective transcending immediate situation through connection to those who had navigated their own periods of family conflict and generational misalignment. Entries from the 1920s documented similar intergenerational tensions when Flapper-era daughters questioned Victorian mothers' understanding of appropriate relationship boundaries and social expectations. Civil War passages recorded disagreements about proper marriage considerations when survival itself remained uncertain amidst national dissolution. Depression-era writings explored conflicts between scarcity-minded parents and children, seeking escape from economic constraints that had narrowed family horizons. These historical parallels provided valuable perspective without minimizing present circumstances' unique challenges. Each generation had faced its own version of values, transmission across changing social conditions, adapting specific practices while maintaining commitment to underlying principles about relationship sustainability and intergenerational support. The journal recorded not just conflicts, but their eventual resolutions, sometimes through compromise, occasionally through temporary separation, allowing perspective development, often through life experiences that revealed enduring value in traditions initially rejected as irrelevant constraints. After several days of reflection, informed by both historical perspective and present emotional processing, I made decision that balanced respect for Alexandra's autonomy with commitment to values embodied in family traditions. Rather than attempting to change her mind about wedding participation, approach unlikely to succeed while potentially damaging already strained relationship, I would focus on maintaining traditions themselves, preserving their availability for potential future reconsideration while respecting her current rejection of their relevance. This approach required careful action regarding the next generation account, established for her marriage symbol. Funds, contributed consistently since her birth specifically designated for supporting commitment ceremony through tangible expression of family's emotional investment in relationship success. Though Alexandra had rejected traditional framing of marriage as intergenerational covenant supported by community practices, the account itself represented decades of concrete action embodying values about commitment that transcended specific ceremonial expressions. After consulting relevant journal entries documenting similar challenges across generations and discussing options with Daniel, I determined most appropriate response involved making account information available to Alexandra without imposing obligation regarding its utilization. This approach honored both the tradition's purpose of supporting marriage beginnings and respect for her autonomy in determining whether and how that support found expression in her particular circumstances. 2 weeks after the coffee shop conversation, I gathered relevant account documents, selected meaningful journal entries from different historical periods, demonstrating tradition's evolution through changing social circumstances, and arranged them in portfolio that presented information, without demanding specific response. This material, combined with brief personal letter neither condemning her choices nor concealing their emotional impact, would be delivered to Alexandra's apartment without expectation of immediate acknowledgement or appreciation. The letter itself required careful composition balancing honest expression with respect for her independence. Avoiding both passive aggression and artificial acceptance of choices that genuinely conflicted with values, I continued considering essential for relationship sustainability. Alexandra, the enclosed documents provide information about the next generation account established at your birth and maintained through consistent contributions over 29 years. This tradition, dating back to the Civil War, represents tangible expression of families' emotional investment in supporting significant life commitments through concrete assistance with their symbolic elements. Edward may have mentioned that I contributed substantial funds toward your engagement ring through arrangement made when he contacted me about family traditions several months ago. What he may not have known is that these funds came specifically from account dedicated to this purpose since your earliest childhood. Concrete expression of intergenerational support that previous generations have found valuable during relationship transitions. The remaining account balance and full documentation are enclosed for your information, along with selected journal entries showing how this tradition has evolved across different historical periods and social circumstances. These materials are provided without obligation or expectation, simply making available resources that belong rightfully to your marriage transition, whether or not they find expression through traditional forms. Your wedding choices reflect values, developed through your particular life experiences and educational formation. While these differ significantly from those embodied in family traditions, they represent authentic expression of your current understanding about what creates sustainable relationships in contemporary context. My hope remains that whatever foundation you establish provides support through life's inevitable challenges and opportunities for genuine flourishing despite changing circumstances. With love transcending differences, Mom, this letter, neither capitulating to values I considered fundamentally misguided, nor condemning choices reflecting Alexandra's genuine, if limited, understanding, represented my best effort at maintaining both personal integrity and relational connection, despite extraordinary circumstances. The journal, documenting how previous generations had navigated their own versions of this challenging territory, provided historical foundation for approaching conflict with perspective transcending immediate emotional reactions. The portfolio, delivery method itself reflected careful balance between making information available and respecting boundaries Alexandra had established through her wedding choices. Rather than presenting materials in person, approach that might create unwelcome emotional dynamics or expectations for immediate response, I arranged courier delivery timed to arrive when her work schedule suggested she would be home alone, creating space for private consideration without performative reaction. The package contents included comprehensive documentation regarding the next generation account, from original establishment through consistent contributions across 29 years to recent substantial withdrawal, supporting engagement ring purchase Edward had negotiated without Alexandra's knowledge. Financial statements demonstrated not just considerable remaining balance, but long-term consistency, transcending periodic economic challenges, concrete embodiment of commitment to intergenerational support despite changing circumstances. Selected journal entries, carefully chosen to demonstrate tradition's evolution rather than rigid preservation, included Civil War origins when community resources supported marriage symbols during national crisis, Depression-era adaptations when financial constraints required creative approaches to maintaining traditional meanings, and 1970s reconsiderations when feminist critique prompted reflection about symbolism without abandoning underlying values of community support for significant commitments. Most significantly, the package included the original small leather-bound journal my mother had given me before college, the blank book in which I had recorded reflections about relationships observed during my own young adult development. This personal volume, containing observations about what patterns seem to create sustainable connections versus relationships vulnerable to inevitable life challenges, represented individualized version of the main family journal focused specifically on relationship foundations rather than broader family wisdom. The complete portfolio, delivered to Alexandra's Manhattan apartment on Wednesday afternoon, represented my considered response to extraordinary circumstances of maternal exclusion. From daughter's wedding, neither angry rejection nor artificial acceptance, this approach maintained tradition's availability while respecting her autonomy to determine whether and how they might find meaningful expression in her particular life circumstances. Whether these materials would find receptive consideration remained entirely uncertain, a reality I acknowledged while processing emotional aftermath of creating boundaries that honored both family values and daughter's independence. The journal entries from previous generations provided valuable perspective that such periods of disconnection sometimes created necessary space for recognition, otherwise impossible through continued patterns of interaction that minimized fundamental values differences. After package delivery, I intentionally suspended expectations regarding Alexandra's response, recognizing that significant reconsideration of fundamental frameworks requires substantial time and often catalyst experiences. Beyond intellectual exposure to alternative perspectives, previous generations had documented similar patterns, with initial rejection of family wisdom frequently followed by eventual re-engagement, after life experiences revealed limitations in alternative frameworks initially embraced as superior to traditional understanding. In the interim, I focused attention on maintaining traditions themselves rather than requiring their acceptance by Alexandra specifically, continuing journal entries documenting current challenges for future generations, maintaining financial practices supporting intergenerational connections, and cultivating community relationships that embodied values about commitment, transcending individual preferences or temporary social trends. Traditions sustain not through imposition but demonstration, my grandmother had written during particularly challenging family conflict in the 1930s. When their underlying wisdom becomes visible through life experiences revealing limitations in approaches that ignore intergenerational perspective, their value emerges not as constraint, but resource for navigating circumstances beyond individual control. This historical wisdom provided foundation for patience during period of separation, created not through geographic distance, but philosophical framework, leaving minimal space for connections not defined primarily through functional contribution or strategic advantage. Whether Alexandra might eventually recognize limitations and approach reducing relationships to optimization problems remained uncertain, but traditions themselves would continue providing resources should such recognition eventually emerge through life experiences challenging market-based understanding of human connection. The weeks following portfolio delivery brought no direct acknowledgement from Alexandra, though Edward sent brief email confirming receipt and describing materials as interesting historical background they would consider within current planning parameters. This corporate response, treating even family traditions as data points for analytical consideration rather than wisdom for moral reflection, reinforced understanding of the profound differences in frameworks guiding our respective approaches to significant life decisions. Wedding preparations continued according to consultant-designed schedule, with Daniel receiving periodic updates regarding his documentation responsibilities, while I remained officially excluded from ceremony planning or participation. Though personally painful, this situation created necessary clarity about fundamental values, differences otherwise potentially obscured through superficial participation, maintaining illusion of alignment despite radically different understandings about relationship meaning and purpose. Sometimes separation precedes genuine connection, because it creates space for recognition impossible through continued patterns minimizing essential differences. Read journal entry from 1890's estrangement, eventually resolved through experiences, revealing wisdom in previously rejected traditional understanding. This historical perspective, while offering no guarantee regarding present circumstances, provided foundation for maintaining both integrity and patience during challenging period, requiring boundaries protecting values considered essential for genuine flourishing. As wedding date approached in June 2009, I focused attention on journal documentation, capturing current challenges within historical context of intergenerational values transmission. These entries, addressing unprecedented circumstances where market thinking had so completely displaced relational understanding in younger generations' approach to life decisions, would provide valuable perspective for future family members, navigating their own versions of this fundamental tension between efficiency metrics and covenant commitment. Whether Alexandra might eventually recognize limitations in framework reducing even mother-daughter relationship to optimization variable remained entirely uncertain, but traditions themselves would continue regardless of individual acceptance or rejection. The journal, financial practices, and community connections embodying values about commitment, transcending changing social circumstances, would remain available should life experiences eventually reveal wisdom previously dismissed as outdated constraint rather than resource for navigating challenges beyond individual control or market solutions. The pivotal development occurred 3 days before scheduled wedding date, when Daniel received unexpected call from Edward regarding ceremony attendance. Technical issue had apparently emerged with planned photography arrangements, creating what Edward described as documentation vulnerability, requiring reconsideration of participation parameters. This corporate framing, approaching even family relationships through functional contribution rather than emotional significance, maintained consistent pattern while creating opening for potential reconnection, however limited by fundamental differences in understanding about relationship meaning and purpose. The celebration consultant has identified potential optimization through integrated familial participation, Edward explained with characteristic efficiency. Modified ceremony structure could accommodate additional attendance within revised documentation parameters. This invitation, framed entirely through functional contribution rather than relational significance, represented first acknowledgement, however indirect, that previous exclusion might have created unnecessary limitation within even their efficiency-focused approach to wedding planning. While maintaining corporate language avoiding emotional dimensions, the call effectively reversed previous decision, excluding me from ceremony participation. How to respond to this functionally framed invitation presented complex considerations, balancing personal dignity with potential relationship restoration, however limited by continuing values differences. After careful reflection, informed by both present circumstances and historical perspective from journal entries documenting similar negotiated boundaries, I determined appropriate response that neither capitulated to dehumanizing framework nor rejected opportunity for presence at significant life milestone. I appreciate reconsideration regarding ceremony attendance, I responded when Daniel conveyed invitation. My participation will respect parameters established for the celebration, while maintaining personal integrity regarding values differences that remain significant despite modified attendance arrangements. This response, acknowledging invitation, without embracing its functional framing, established boundaries protecting personal dignity while accepting opportunity for presence at daughter's wedding despite profound disagreement with values guiding its planning and execution. Neither capitulation nor rejection, this position maintained both integrity and openness to potential connection, despite continuing framework differences. Throughout this challenging period, the journal provided valuable perspective transcending immediate emotional reactions through connection to previous generations who had navigated their own versions of values transmission across changing social circumstances. Their experiences, documented with both vulnerability about painful disconnections and wisdom about potential resolutions through life's inevitable challenges to limited frameworks, offered foundation for approaching present situation with patience, transcending immediate desire for either confrontation or artificial reconciliation. The most valuable gift across generations isn't specific advice, but demonstrated resilience through circumstances revealing limitations in every approach to life's fundamental challenges. My grandmother had written during particularly difficult family conflict eventually resolved through experiences no theoretical framework had anticipated. Traditions endure not through rigid preservation, but living demonstration of values that remain essential despite changing expressions across different historical moments. This wisdom, balancing commitment to enduring values with flexibility regarding their specific expressions, provided foundation for navigating unprecedented circumstances where market thinking had so completely displaced relational understanding in younger generations' approach to even most significant life decisions. Whether Alexandra might eventually recognize limitations in this framework remained uncertain, but traditions themselves would continue providing resources should such recognition emerge through inevitable life experiences, challenging reduction of relationships to optimization variables. The journal? The Financial Practices and Community Connections Embodying Values About Commitment. Transcending individual preferences or temporary social trends remained available regardless of their current acceptance or rejection. Living testament to perspective extending beyond immediate circumstances or limited frameworks into wisdom accumulated through generations, facing their own versions of challenges, ultimately revealing essential human needs. No market metrics or efficiency calculations could adequately address. The morning of Alexandra's wedding arrived with June sunshine illuminating the meticulously manicured garden venue selected for its optimal aesthetic metrics. I dressed carefully in an elegant but understated navy silk outfit, a choice reflecting my intention to maintain dignity while genuinely seeking connection despite our profound differences. Daniel and I arrived precisely on time, greeted by staff, consulting tablets before directing us to our designated positions. Daniel has been assigned to Photography Station 3, the coordinator explained while checking her device. Margaret, your seating has been arranged in Section B, Row 7, according to the optimization algorithm's distribution parameters. My assigned seat was at the periphery, technically present but minimally visible, a physical manifestation of my marginal role in Alexandra's current understanding of meaningful relationships. The assembled guests were predominantly professional, connections rather than personal friends, their conversations focused on market conditions and investment strategies rather than the couple's relationship. Edward's recent portfolio restructuring demonstrated exceptional market timing, one guest remarked to another. This alliance with Alexandra creates synergistic advantages through complementary network access. The ceremony proceeded with precision, managed through technology rather than natural rhythms. Officiants spoke of partnership optimization and mutual success potential in language suggesting a corporate merger rather than a spiritual covenant. Throughout this orchestrated experience, I focused on the genuine commitment being established, despite its expression through such different language than our family traditions had used. The pivotal moment came unexpectedly during what the program called the personal expression segment. Edward spoke of strategic compatibility and aligned priorities, but when Alexandra began her statement, something shifted midway through. Our partnership represents optimal alignment of professional trajectories, she began according to apparent plan, before her gaze unexpectedly fell on the portfolio I had sent, which I now noticed rested partially visible beneath the ceremonial table. She paused, then continued with subtly different language. But it also connects us to something larger than our individual achievements, she continued, her voice taking on a quality I hadn't heard since her childhood. Through this commitment, we join a generational story that extends both backward and forward beyond our particular moment. Then, rather than proceeding directly to the ring exchange, Alexandra reached beneath the table and withdrew the embroidered handkerchief I had included in the portfolio. Without announcement, she simply incorporated this traditional element into the ceremony, briefly dabbing unexpected emotion during the ring exchange, a small but significant bridge between her modern celebration and the traditions she had previously dismissed. The reception maintained the event's managed nature, with interactions orchestrated through seating arrangements designed for optimal network development. My assigned table positioned me with distant professional connections rather than family members, physically embodying Alexandra's framework, prioritizing strategic relationships over familial bonds. An unexpected opportunity for connection came during a brief interlude between scheduled segments, when Alexandra approached my table during a rare moment without consultant oversight. "I wanted to acknowledge receipt of the portfolio," she began, formally before slightly shifting her tone. The historical documentation provided unexpected context for current circumstances. The tradition has always been about supporting beginnings rather than controlling outcomes, I responded carefully. Each generation adapts specific expressions while maintaining essential commitment to relationships that matter beyond immediate circumstances. Alexandra maintained her corporate language. The financial structuring demonstrated impressive foresight regarding asset development. Intergenerational planning creates significant advantages through extended time horizons exceeding quarterly. Performance metrics. The financial component matters less than the perspective it represents, I offered gently. Consistent contributions across changing circumstances demonstrate commitment to values persisting beyond immediate conditions, perspective that has sustained relationships through challenges exceeding contemporary frameworks' capacity to address. As Alexandra was called away to the next scheduled segment, she hesitated momentarily. "The documentation you provided demonstrated commitment preceding current circumstances. That persistence across variable conditions warrants further consideration. Regarding optimal relationship structures." Near the evening's conclusion, Edward intercepted us at the exit. "I wanted to acknowledge your contribution to the ring acquisition process," he stated, gesturing subtly toward Alexandra across the room, the 3-carat diamond catching the light. The intergenerational funding mechanism provided significant advantages. Alexandra has been reviewing the historical documentation with unexpected interest regarding traditional structures adapted to contemporary circumstances. The tradition has always evolved to address changing circumstances while maintaining essential commitments, I responded. Each generation adapts specific forms while preserving perspective that relationships require resources beyond immediate conditions to sustain through inevitable challenges. Edward nodded. The longitudinal approach demonstrates strategic advantages over quarterly-focused planning. Alexandra has indicated interest in potential adaptation of traditional structures while maintaining historically validated elements. 5 months after the wedding, a small package arrived unexpectedly at our home. Inside was a brief note. "Mom, the celebration consultant has completed post-event analysis demonstrating statistically significant correlation between traditional elements and participant satisfaction metrics. Independent research confirms potential advantages of intergenerational perspective regarding relationship sustainability across variable conditions." Historical documentation suggests attached object traditionally transitions between generations following significant commitment ceremonies. While contemporary adaptations may modify specific implementation patterns, underlying structural elements maintain relevance across variable social contexts. Alexandra. The package contained Daniel's handcrafted wooden engagement ring box with the embroidered handkerchief Alexandra had incorporated into her wedding. Close examination revealed something remarkable. A small section recently added to the generations of women's contributions surrounding its border. This new addition featured precise stitches forming a geometric pattern that integrated contemporary design with traditional structure. Alexandra's own contribution to the family artifact she had previously dismissed. My response acknowledged this meaningful step while respecting her autonomy. "Alexandra, thank you for this thoughtful continuation of family tradition. Your contribution to the handkerchief beautifully integrates contemporary design with historical structure, precisely how meaningful traditions evolve while maintaining essential connections across different periods." The wooden box carries its own significance through both craftsmanship and symbolism. Its return completes traditional cycle while creating foundation for ongoing adaptations, addressing your specific circumstances. Traditions endure because they address enduring human needs. for connection transcending individual lifespans or particular social conditions. Each generation discovers their relevance not through obligation, but experience, revealing dimensions of relationship exceeding contemporary frameworks' capacity to fully address. With appreciation for both continuity and adaptation, Mom, the following months brought additional indications of incremental development. During a brief visit while attending a professional conference near our home, Alexandra made an unexpected reference to family traditions. We've been analyzing optimal approaches to legacy development across extended timeframes, she explained. Traditional structures demonstrate significant advantages regarding value transmission. The journal documentation provides relevant case studies across variable historical conditions. Her request at the visit's conclusion suggested meaningful shift. We would be interested in reviewing additional journal documentation regarding adaptation methodologies during previous transitional periods. Historical case studies provide valuable reference points for contemporary implementation strategies. 6 months after Alexandra and Edward's wedding, I stood quietly in the back of a small garden ceremony they had arranged to mark their first anniversary, an event notably lacking consultant management or efficiency optimization. This gathering included only family members and close friends, rather than strategic professional connections. Most remarkably, Alexandra had incorporated several traditional elements, readings selected from journal entries, the handkerchief visibly carried rather than briefly utilized without acknowledgement, even reference to the intergenerational support that had contributed to their marriage beginning through the ring. While contemporary implementation necessarily differs from historical expressions, certain foundational elements maintain relevance across changing circumstances, she stated. Intergenerational perspective provides valuable reference points, exceeding conventional timeframes, resources supporting sustainability through variable conditions beyond immediate market metrics. As the ceremony concluded and Alexandra's gaze briefly met mine across the small gathering, I recognized complex emotions beneath her composed features, genuine if limited appreciation for traditions previously rejected, incremental recognition. That intergenerational perspective might offer resources beyond efficiency metrics. Some legacies are worth preserving, she acknowledged, the 3-carat diamond ring catching light with momentary brilliance. This statement, while limited by her continuing corporate framework, suggested meaningful opening toward understanding connections across generations. Standing quietly at the back, I witnessed not an endpoint, but a beginning. Incremental movement toward recognition that might develop through life experiences, revealing wisdom in traditions previously dismissed. The journey remained incomplete, with corporate language still dominating Alexandra's approach, yet a meaningful opening had emerged. Had Alexandra fully accepted our traditional view of marriage? No. Did she completely understand the deep meaning behind our traditions? Not yet. But there was beautiful progress. Her incorporating our traditions, even in her own way, even through her own worldview lens, showed genuine movement. Most importantly, her tearful eyes meeting mine revealed something beyond corporate language and efficiency metrics. Recognition that some connections transcend strategic positioning, that some traditions carry meaning worth preserving across generations. The ring that had started our conflict now symbolized our tentative reconnection. Not perfect understanding, but genuine progress toward recognizing that true legacy exists in relationships, not just assets. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.